What if an old cracked driveway was hiding more than just broken concrete? When a female mechanic moved into a quiet farmhouse on the edge of Arizona, all she wanted was peace. But what she found buried beneath her feet changed everything. A rusty diesel engine, hidden underground, attached to a secret that had been buried for over 80 years. This isn't just a story about machines. It's about voices that were silenced, and the woman who uncovered them. Stay with us because what this female mechanic found beneath that buried diesel engine will leave you speechless. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. Claire Maddox had always believed that sometimes life whispers instead of shouts, and you have to be quiet enough to hear it. At 38, she'd spent most of her life with a wrench in one hand and grit under her nails. She ran her own small garage in a sun-baked Arizona town, fixing diesel engines, patching up beat-up trucks, and never asking for more than a quiet evening and a strong cup of coffee. The city had never been kind to her, a single woman in a man's trade, working twice as hard for half the thanks. But there was a strength in her silence, a resolve in her hands. So when the days began to blur, and the nights stretched too long with nothing but the sound of engines still humming in her ears, Claire made a decision. She bought an old farmhouse on the edge of town, far from the screeching tires and relentless clang of steel. The listing said it needed a little love, but what she saw was space. Space to breathe. Space to finally rest. The moment she stepped onto that cracked driveway, with the wind brushing against the worn paint of the porch, Claire didn't know she was standing above a secret. But the secret knew her. The first few days in the new house were filled with the kind of silence Claire Maddox had longed for. It was a silence that wrapped itself around her like a soft old coat, worn, comfortable, and finally hers. She spent her mornings unpacking, her afternoons fixing creaky hinges and patching chipped walls, and her evenings sitting on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee as the Arizona sun melted into the dusty horizon. And for the first time in years, she felt still. But even in that stillness, something odd kept tugging at her. It started with the driveway. The old concrete was cracked, spider-webbed with deep veins like something had been struggling underneath it for years. It wasn't unusual, old houses had their quirks. Still, every time Claire backed her battered Dodge truck over it, she felt a jolt, not just from the uneven surface, but from something deeper, subtler, like the earth wasn't quite solid beneath her. She made a mental note, I'll patch that soon, but the task never made it to the top of her list. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the wooden ceiling, she heard it, a soft scrape. Faint, like gravel brushing against metal. She held her breath, thinking maybe it was just the wind or the house settling. But it came again, a low, dragging sound. Then silence. She sat up in bed and listened harder. The sound didn't repeat. Still, it left a chill in her spine that lingered longer than she cared to admit. The next few nights were the same. Nothing loud, nothing obvious, just whispers of movement, buried in the quiet. Claire had never been the superstitious type. She believed in hard work and timing belts, not ghosts and gut feelings, but something about the driveway, something about those sounds felt off. It was like the house was holding its breath beneath her feet. One early morning, just before sunrise, she grabbed her thermos and headed out to the truck. The air was cold and dry, the kind that clung to your skin and turned your breath visible. She climbed in, turned the key, and listened to the old diesel engine roar to life. That familiar rumble was a comfort. a reminder that some things still made sense. But when she shifted into reverse and tapped the gas, the truck didn't move. Her brow furrowed. She shifted again. The tires groaned. Then came a sudden, uneven lurch. A dip. The rear of the truck sagged slightly to one side. She killed the engine. Heart pounding. Claire jumped out and walked around the back. And there it was, one of the concrete pavers had given way. It had collapsed into a shallow depression. Maybe a foot wide. Maybe more. The rear tire had sunk slightly into it, like the earth had swallowed just enough to make its presence known. She crouched beside it, brushed her fingers along the jagged edge of the broken concrete, and felt something strange. Beneath the hole, under a thin layer of soil, something metallic gleamed dully in the dim morning light. It wasn't a pipe, it wasn't stone or rebar, it was flat, rusted, too uniform to be natural. She froze. It looked like the top of something man-made, something buried. Logic tried to take over. Maybe it's just an old septic tank cover, or some kind of storm drain. But her gut whispered otherwise. The sounds, the shifting earth, the way the previous owner had rushed the paperwork. All of it came rushing back. She grabbed a trowel from the garage and started digging. The soil gave way too easily. Loose. Recently disturbed. Maybe. That only made her more uneasy. As more of the object came into view, her heart beat harder. It wasn't just a sheet of metal. It was shaped rectangular, with edges so precise they couldn't be accidental. At one end, nearly fused to the rust, was a curved handle. Claire stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a hatch. For a long time. She sat back on her heels, the dirt caked on her jeans, the morning sun beginning to rise behind her. The world around her was waking up birds chirping, a dog barking somewhere down the road, but all she could hear was the sound of her own breath. Someone had buried this, deliberately, and for the first time since buying the house, she felt something other than peace. It wasn't fear exactly. Not yet. It was something older, something deeper. A presence. She rose slowly and backed away, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. She looked down at the hole, at the exposed metal, at the cracks stretching outward like veins toward her house. Claire Maddox had come here for quiet, but the earth beneath her had been waiting. And now it had begun to speak. Claire Maddox couldn't stop thinking about the hatch. All day at the garage, her hands worked on carburetors and timing chains, but her mind kept drifting back to that rusted curve of metal just beneath the soil. Every clang of a wrench sounded like the groan of corroded hinges. Every hiss of a compressor reminded her of the soft scrape she'd heard in the night. By the time she drove home, the sky was already stretching into the deep purples of dusk. She parked the truck carefully well away from the sunken paver and grabbed a flashlight. She didn't bother changing out of her work boots. The wind had picked up, sending dry leaves skittering across the driveway. The hatch waited for her, just as she'd left it. She crouched beside it, her breath catching in the back of her throat as the beam of her flashlight swept over the edges. The handle was still there, still cold, still waiting. She wrapped her fingers around it and pulled. Nothing? She braced her feet, set her jaw, and pulled again, this time with her full body weight. A groan escaped from somewhere deep in the ground. A sound like metal weeping, then, finally, a shift. The hatch gave way by an inch, just enough to breathe. And from below, a draft of air rose cold, damp, and laced with the scent of time. It wasn't rot exactly. It was older than that. Like stone and rust and something once forgotten. Claire's skin prickled. She didn't open it fully. Not yet. Not alone. Instead, she grabbed her phone and snapped a photo. Then she did what any woman with an ounce of caution and a truckload of curiosity would do. She went inside, made herself a strong cup of coffee, and stared at that photo until the room went quiet. But sleep wouldn't come that night. She kept waking up, convinced she heard something soft creaks, like footsteps muffled by years of silence. But every time she got up and looked outside, the driveway was still. Still, and watching. The next morning, she decided she had to know. Not guess? Not wonder? No. She grabbed a crowbar, a dust mask, and a set of gloves from the garage, then returned to the hatch. The earth around it was loose, just like the day before. She pried it wider, enough to see inside. A narrow shaft stretched down, framed by old bricks slick with moisture. A metal ladder was bolted to the side, its rungs rusted, but intact. Her flashlight beam danced across them, then landed at the bottom a dirt floor. Shadows. The edge of something that looked like a wall. Claire's pulse pounded. She tested the top rung with her boot. It held. She tied a rope around her waist, looped the other end around the base of a nearby post, and began to descend, one foot after another. Careful, controlled. Each step echoed slightly, not from sound, but from memory. Like the walls had once heard footsteps like hers and hadn't forgotten. When her boots touched the bottom, she stood still for a long moment. The space was a small chamber, maybe 10 by 10 feet. The walls were reinforced with concrete, lined with faint chalk marks that had long since faded. Her flashlight swept slowly across the room, and what she saw made her breath catch. There were old tin cans stacked neatly in a corner, crumbled newspapers, shards of broken glass bottles, and sitting against the far wall a wooden crate, half buried, weathered by time. She knelt beside it and brushed away the dirt. The wood groaned under her fingers. With a tug, the lid came loose. Inside, wrapped in layers of brittle fabric, was a small diesel engine, compact, rust-covered, but unmistakably real. Claire stared at it in disbelief. What was a diesel engine doing buried in a hidden chamber under a suburban driveway? She leaned in closer, brushing off a layer of dust. And that's when she saw it faintly etched on the engine casing, nearly lost to rust and time. Initials, a name, carved by hand. She whispered it aloud, the sound bouncing softly off the walls. M.J. 1942. Suddenly, the air felt heavier. Not threatening, just filled. As if the space had been waiting for someone to say that name again. She turned her flashlight back to the walls. There were markings she hadn't seen before, words scratched into the concrete, half erased by moisture and dust. One stood out among the rest. They said there was no space, so we built our own. Claire backed up slowly, her heart aching in a way she hadn't expected. This wasn't just a buried engine. It was a piece of a story. Someone, maybe many, had come down here, bringing what little they had, food, tools, a machine, hope. They'd carved a life into the soil because the world above had no room for them. And now that story had risen to the surface, not with noise, but with a whisper. For the rest of the day, Claire Maddox moved through her house like a shadow. She washed the dirt from her hands, but it clung under her nails. She made coffee, but it went cold, untouched. The house, once a place of quiet comfort, now felt different. Not ominous, just alive, watching. The chamber below had rattled something loose in her, She'd gone down there expecting to find maybe a pipe, maybe an old well. What she found instead was a story, a voice buried under time and concrete, whispering out through rust and dust and silence. And she couldn't stop hearing it. Later that evening, Claire sat at the edge of her porch. The sky was wide and bruised with the colors of oncoming night. In the distance, the wind rustled through the tall grass and whistled between the eaves of the house. She watched the cracked driveway stretch ahead of her, ordinary and broken as ever. But now she knew. Beneath those old slabs of concrete, someone had lived. Someone had hidden. Someone had carved their name into the casing of a diesel engine and sealed it into the earth, as if to say, "We were here." Claire had spent her entire life surrounded by engines. She'd pulled them apart and rebuilt them from memory. But she'd never looked at one and thought, this is a symbol of survival. Not until now. She stood, walked back to the hatch, and stared down at the shadows below. The air that rose from the opening was cooler than before, carrying with it a kind of memory. She didn't go down again that night. She just stood there, hand resting lightly on the edge, feeling the weight of the moment. Then she remembered something the man who'd sold her the house. How rushed he'd been, the way he'd avoided eye contact, how quickly he'd brushed past her questions about the property's history. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, just another old-timer eager to move south and forget the winters. But now she wondered, had he known? Had he known what lay just a few feet beneath the surface? Had he walked across that driveway with the same uneasy awareness Claire now carried? Or had he buried it all literally and emotionally, hoping it would stay quiet? Claire went back inside and dug through the drawer where she kept the house documents. She flipped through brittle papers, scanned the names, the signatures, the inspection notes. There wasn't much, just a thin folder full of vague legalese and yellowed photocopies. Nothing about a shelter, nothing about a hidden chamber. But that didn't surprise her. Secrets didn't write themselves down. They were passed in glances, in silences, in buried engines that no one was supposed to find. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time Claire closed her eyes, she saw the hatch, the ladder, the carved name on the rusted casing. M. J. 1942. And every time she rolled over in bed, she thought about that message on the wall. They said there was no space, so we built our own. By morning, the silence of the house had grown heavier, not hostile, just dense, like the air itself was waiting for her to act. So she did what she always did when the world didn't make sense. She went to work. Claire spent the day at the garage with her hands buried deep in the hood of a stalled delivery van. Grease coated her palms. Her hair was pulled back. Her boots were planted firm on the oil-stained floor. But her mind was still underground. At lunch, she pulled out her phone and typed the name into a search bar. M.J. 1942, Arizona. Nothing useful came up. Too vague. Too wide. So she changed tactics. That evening, she drove down to the town library, one of those small brick buildings tucked between a diner and a drugstore, where the scent of old paper lived in every corner. A librarian with silver-rimmed glasses gave her a quiet nod and led her to the back where the archives were kept. Claire sifted through old newspapers, property records, war-era reports. She learned that during World War II, parts of rural Arizona had been used to house temporary labor forces, mostly minorities, who weren't allowed to live in the main parts of town. Some were migrant workers. Some were black families brought in to work in factories or on the railroad. There were no photos, just a few brief mentions in local articles, small, quiet acknowledgments of entire lives erased from memory. One article from 1943 caught her eye. It mentioned an unofficial shelter built near the edge of town, used by non-eligible residents during air raid drills. The phrasing was cold, sanitized, but Claire could read between the lines. That was them. That was her driveway. She leaned back in the wooden chair, fingers trembling slightly as they rested on the yellowed page. Her heart ached not from fear, but from the weight of knowing. This wasn't just a mechanical mystery anymore. It was history. It was injustice. It was resilience. And for the first time in a long time, Claire Maddox didn't feel alone. She felt connected to the hands that had dug that chamber, to the people who had waited in silence, to whoever M.G. was, and whatever he had meant when he carved those initials into steel. They hadn't been asking to be remembered, but now they would be. Claire Maddox stood in her driveway the next morning, steaming coffee in one hand, eyes fixed on the hatch that had changed everything. The light from the rising sun cast a soft glow on the cracked concrete, painting long shadows across the earth like silent reminders of what lay below. She had barely touched her coffee, her thoughts too tangled to enjoy its warmth. She knew now without a doubt that what she had found wasn't just forgotten steel and dust. It was evidence. It was truth. And truth had a way of not letting go. She wasn't sure when the idea had taken root, but it had been growing quietly ever since she left the library the night before. The hatch couldn't stay hidden. Not anymore. It didn't feel right to keep it a secret, not when so many voices had already been silenced once. So Claire made a decision. She grabbed her notebook and wrote down everything she knew so far. The initials on the engine, the message on the wall, the layout of the chamber. She documented the location, the state of the structure, even the rough dimensions. She took photos, detailed, respectful, careful. Then she picked up the phone and made a call. The woman who answered at the local historical society sounded skeptical at first. Claire expected that. But as she described the hatch, the chamber, the artifacts inside, the voice on the other end grew quiet. "Can we come see it?" the woman finally asked. Claire nodded, even though she knew they couldn't see her. "Yes," she said. "You need to." 2 days later, 3 people stood in her driveway, a local historian named Dr. Marla Jameson, a preservation architect, and a young assistant carrying a high-resolution camera and a stack of forms. They were quiet as Claire led them down into the earth. The air was still cool, still heavy with memory. When they stepped into the chamber, something shifted. Even the professionals fell silent. The flashlight beams passed over the diesel engine, the scrawled message on the wall, the bits of fabric and rusted cans. Claire watched as their faces changed, not with fear, but with reverence. Dr. Jameson touched the wall lightly, almost like an apology. "This wasn't built by accident," she whispered. "This was survival. And no one wrote it down." Claire nodded. "That's why I called." They spent hours documenting everything. They took samples, scanned the walls, and carefully handled the items left behind. Claire stayed close, answering questions, offering context, watching them interact with something that had once only whispered to her in the dark. Before they left, Dr. Jameson pulled Claire aside. "This needs to be preserved," she said. "But not just preserved. Shared." Claire felt a strange mix of nerves and pride swirl in her chest. "I was thinking the same thing." Word spread faster than Claire expected. At first, just a few neighbors stopped by, curious, hesitant. Some offered half-hearted jokes, the kind people make when they're uncomfortable. Others brought pie or coffee as if unsure how else to say, "We believe you now." And then came the reporters. Local news, then regional, then a national podcast crew who wanted to record an episode about the mechanic and the memory beneath. Claire didn't care for the attention. But she let them in. Not for her. For the story. Every time she opened that hatch for someone, she did it with the same steady hands that had rebuilt hundreds of engines over the years, but now they carried something more sacred. She wasn't just fixing something broken anymore. She was revealing something buried. The community's response was mixed. Some praised her for bringing the past to light. Others muttered about stirring up things best left alone. One man even told her, "You should have just sealed it back up and left it there. Some stories don't need retelling." Claire didn't argue. She didn't shout. She just looked him in the eye and said, "Maybe that's why they got buried in the first place." With help from the Historical Society and a growing network of volunteers, the chamber was stabilized and slowly cleaned respectfully. Carefully. Claire built a wooden staircase beside the old ladder to make it safer to descend. She donated the engine to be displayed in a climate-controlled case right inside the chamber. A small sign now stood at the edge of the driveway. The Maddox Underground Refuge discovered 2025, in honor of those who were forced to build their own safety when none was offered. Children came on field trips. Older residents stood in silence, some with tears in their eyes. People began to remember things, not facts from textbooks but feelings, memories passed down in stories half told. And suddenly, Claire's quiet home became a place where history breathed again. One afternoon, an elderly woman with silver braids visited the chamber. She touched the wall with trembling hands and whispered, "My grandfather helped dig a shelter like this. Said they weren't welcome in town. Said they had to make space with their own hands." She turned to Claire and smiled sadly. "I didn't believe him until now." Claire felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. She had never set out to become a voice for the forgotten. But somehow, the house had chosen her. The earth had cracked open, and the silence had trusted her with a secret too heavy for one person to carry. So she opened it to the world, and in doing so, Claire Maddox discovered something even more powerful than the whisper beneath her feet. A purpose. The hatch had become more than a doorway to the past. It had become a mirror. Claire Maddox wasn't the same woman who had bought that worn-out farmhouse hoping for peace and quiet. She still wore grease-stained boots and kept her hair tied back with the same frayed bandana, but something inside her had shifted. She no longer just fixed engines. She carried a story. And yet, there was still one part of the story that refused to come into focus. One mystery that whispered louder with each step she took into that chamber. "Who was, Jay?" The initials on the rusted diesel casing haunted her. The year 1942 was seared into her mind. Everyone had theories. Some said it must have been a mechanic like her. Others guessed it was the family name of whoever had built the shelter. But Claire didn't want guesses. She wanted truth. So she went back to the archives. Again and again. She scoured every record, every dusty newspaper, every forgotten ledger. She even called in a favor from a friend in Phoenix who worked at a genealogy center. And then 3 weeks after the first news report aired, she got a call that made her heart stop. "I think I found him," the woman on the line said. Who Claire asked, breathless. The man behind the initials, Marcus Jennings. Black, born 1915. Diesel mechanic. Drafted in 43. Never returned. And he had a daughter. Claire went completely still. A daughter. The woman's name was Loretta Jennings, and she was 84 years old. She lived just 4 hours away, in a quiet, assisted living facility outside Flagstaff. Claire didn't hesitate. She packed a small bag, covered the garage for the weekend, and drove through the desert with the hum of the engine vibrating in her chest. When she walked into Loretta's room, time seemed to still. The woman sat in a faded floral chair by the window, her silver hair braided down her back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You must be Claire," Loretta said before Claire could speak. Her voice was soft, but steady. "I saw you on the news." Claire nodded, eyes already stinging. "I found the shelter, and I think your father helped build it." Loretta didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window for a long, aching moment. Then she spoke. "He told me about it once. Just once. I was maybe 10. Said they had to dig in secret. Said the town didn't want them in the public shelters." Her voice trembled, but her gaze was sharp. "He called it the room beneath the silence. Said if I ever felt forgotten, I should remember what was beneath my feet." Claire couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears came quietly, rolling down her cheeks without fanfare. "I saw his initials," she whispered. "On the engine. M.J. 1942. Loretta closed her eyes and pressed a hand to her mouth. "Diesel engine?" she asked. Claire nodded. "He rebuilt it with his bare hands," Loretta said. "Carried it down piece by piece when no one was watching. Said it might be needed. Said even in hiding, we deserved light and movement." They sat together for hours. Loretta told Claire about the fear her family lived with, the way her father worked late into the night to provide for people who were never allowed to stand beside him in the daylight. She remembered sleeping in the shelter during air raid drills, clutching her father's coat and listening to the low hum of that engine. "He was the only man I ever trusted," Loretta said softly, "and the world buried him." Claire reached out and held her hand. "Not anymore." She said, "I promise you, Loretta, your father's story won't stay in the dark." 1 week later, Claire invited Loretta to the chamber. She helped her down carefully step by cautious step until they stood in the same space Marcus Jennings had built with his hands, hidden beneath a town that never made room for him. When Loretta touched the wall where her father had once scratched that message, they said there was no space. So we built our own. She fell silent. And then, as if time folded in on itself, she whispered through tears, "Daddy, I remember now." The whole room seemed to exhale. Claire watched from the corner, her own eyes wet, her heart full and aching. This wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about restoration. This was about dignity returned not by digging up bones, but by honoring the dreams they dared to protect underground. That night, Claire stood in her yard long after everyone had left. The hatch was closed again, but its presence pulsed through the soil beneath her boots. She had come here to escape the noise of the world, but she had found something louder than noise. She had found truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. The day the plaque was unveiled, the sky was a deep, unwavering blue, the kind of sky that felt too wide for words. Claire Maddox stood beside Loretta Jennings, her hand lightly resting on the older woman's shoulder as the small crowd gathered in her yard. Children fidgeted in the back rows. A few reporters whispered notes into their phones. The mayor stood stiffly near the porch, unsure if he should smile or remain somber. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what stood behind them. The hatch had been reinforced and preserved, no longer hidden by concrete or fear. A wooden railing surrounded it now, and a gently sloping staircase led into the chamber below, no longer a secret, but a memorial. At the front, nestled into a small stone base, the plaque read, "The Jennings Refuge, 1942, a sanctuary built in silence, discovered by Claire Maddox, 2025, in honor of those who were told they didn't belong, but refused to disappear." Loretta traced her fingers over the words with reverence. "They told us we were safer out of sight," she said softly. "But now they can't look away." Claire felt the weight of those words like an anchor in her chest and a compass at the same time. Over the next few weeks, Visitors came from far and wide. Veterans who'd never spoken about their own buried truths. Teachers who brought entire classrooms to show them that history wasn't just in textbooks, it was under their very feet. Descendants of laborers, of segregated workers, of erased names. Some came with old photographs, others with nothing but memory. But all of them came with heart. One little boy, no older than 7, stood at the edge of the hatch and tugged at Claire's sleeve. "Was the man who built it like me?" he asked. Claire knelt down beside him and smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "just like you. Brave, quiet, and stronger than most people ever knew." The boy nodded like it mattered, because it did. Claire kept the garage open during the day, but most of her evenings were spent curating what the space had become part museum, part monument, part unspoken prayer. She created a small exhibit inside the chamber, carefully sealed behind glass a faded cloth, a rusted wrench, a child's wooden block, and, at the heart of it all, the diesel engine. It had been cleaned just enough to show its age and the initials carved into its side. J, 1942. People stood in front of it and wept, not because it was mechanical, but because it was human. One Sunday afternoon, long after the crowds had thinned and the air had begun to cool, Claire sat alone at the edge of the driveway. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting a golden light that touched everything gently like memory itself. She thought about the first night she heard the sounds beneath her bed, the strange silence that followed, the tire sinking into the soft earth, the hatch, rusted and stubborn, groaning open like a wound being acknowledged for the first time. She remembered how small she had felt, crouched alone with nothing but a flashlight and a heart full of questions. Now, she didn't feel small at all. She felt whole. For most of her life, Claire Maddox had lived quietly, fixed things, solved problems, kept her head down. She never thought of herself as the kind of person who would change anything, just someone who kept old machines running. But maybe that's what this was all along. Maybe this wasn't about discovery. Maybe it was about repair. Not of engines, but of truth, of dignity, of voices buried too long in the silence of other people's comfort. One evening, as the first stars blinked awake, Loretta came to sit with her. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. After a while, Loretta reached over and placed a folded photograph in Claire's hand. It was a sepia-toned image. A man in oil-stained overalls, crouched beside a diesel engine, his face proud, tired, and unmistakably kind. Claire's breath caught. "Marcus Jennings," Loretta said. "That was taken the year he built the chamber." Claire held the photo like it was sacred. "Because it was—" "He'd be proud of you," Loretta whispered. "He always said, engines are like people, they'll keep running if someone just takes the time to care." Claire blinked fast to keep the tears from spilling. Then she smiled. "I think we finally got him running again," she said. The wind shifted gently through the trees. The hatch creaked once, softly, as if echoing the laughter and hope it had once protected. And under the Arizona sky, the mechanic who had found a buried engine, a forgotten name, and a legacy built in darkness sat in the fading light and finally felt peace. Not the silence she had once longed for, but something deeper, something earned. Some stories are buried not because they are forgotten, but because they were never given permission to be told. Claire Maddox didn't set out to become anyone's voice. She wasn't chasing justice, or history, or truth. She just wanted quiet. A place to breathe. What she found beneath her driveway was more than steel and dust. It was a legacy carved by those who had no choice but to build their own safety, their own dignity, in a world that shut them out. The lesson wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about honoring it, For Claire and for those who follow the past wasn't something to fear. It was something to carry forward. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that reveal the courage buried beneath the surface. Click to continue the journey and hit subscribe if you believe forgotten voices deserve to be heard.